The following account was transcribed from audio recording. The narrator requested it be published verbatim, without editorial correction. His words are preserved as spoken. I don't usually cry on the job. 22 years covering wars, riots, plague outbreaks, first contact situations. I've seen things that would rearrange the furniture inside your skull. I've watched species go extinct in real time. I've reported from battlefields where the dead outnumbered the living 3-1, and nobody on either side seemed to notice anymore. I don't cry. But I'm going to tell you about a man named Decker Havens, and I'm going to warn you right now. If you have any part of you that still responds to the idea of a father who loves his kid more than he loves his own heartbeat, you're going to feel something before this is over. I know I did. Let me start from the beginning because the beginning matters. The beginning always matters, even when nobody wants to sit through it. I was on Velaris as press credentials for the Sector 9 Diplomatic Summit, one of those big galactic handshake events where 40 different species spend 3 days eating each other's food badly and pretending they understand each other's jokes. The Velkari had been hosting these summits for about 2 centuries. They were good at it. Their throne world was specifically designed for multi-species comfort, breathable atmosphere across 12 different biological requirements, gravity plating that adjusted per floor, temperature zones marked by color-coded corridors. The Velkari themselves looked like something drawn by a child who'd been told to combine an octopus and a cathedral. They were tall, 7 to 9 feet on average, with bodies that split at the torso into 4 semi-independent upper limbs, and a lower structure that moved like a dancer's even when they were just standing still. Their skin cycled through bioluminescent colors the way a sunset cycles through orange. When they were calm, they glowed a soft amber. When they were agitated, you'd see veins of dark violet pulse through their skin like storm lightning underwater. And their queen, her eminent Saravath of the 7th ascending throne, was the most extraordinary living thing I had ever seen in my life, and I have seen things that would make most people reconsider their relationship with the word extraordinary. She stood nearly 11 feet tall. Her bioluminescence didn't cycle, it sang. It moved in waves and harmonics. When she walked through a room, every photosensitive surface in that room responded. Cameras adjusted, screens flickered. Lesser creatures squinted without knowing why. She radiated something that wasn't quite heat and wasn't quite sound but was somehow both. I had been trying to get an interview with her for 3 years. She granted interviews roughly as often as a star goes supernova, which is to say, occasionally, and with devastating results. The human delegation was small. That surprised me, honestly. Earth had sent a team of 9, which, for a summit this size, was almost laughably modest. Most major species sent delegations of 40 or 50. The Rithkani had sent 300, though to be fair, Rithkani biology made individual opinions structurally impossible, so 300 of them counted as maybe 1.5 opinions total. 9 humans. I remember watching them check into the diplomatic quarters on level 7 and thinking they looked exhausted before anything had even happened. Which was a very human quality. I'd noticed over the years, humans arrived pre-exhausted, as if they'd burned through 3 days of worry in the shuttle on the way over. Decker Havens was not officially part of the delegation. That's the part that still gets me, even now. He wasn't a diplomat. He wasn't a security officer. He wasn't attached to any government body. He was the personal aide and, more accurately, the father of Dr. Calla Havens, who was the youngest xenobiologist Earth had ever appointed to a summit of this level. She was 26 years old. She'd published 4 papers on Velkari neural lattice communication before most xenobiologists her age had even settled on a specialty. Calla Havens was brilliant. She was also, by her own admission in the 3 minutes she talked to me at the arrival reception, terrified of enclosed spaces, and had never left the Sol system before this assignment. Decker had come because she asked him to. That was it. That was the whole reason. His daughter had been assigned to the most significant diplomatic summit in Earth's interstellar history, and she'd called him from Geneva and said, "Dad, I know it's a lot to ask, and I know you have your own life, but I'm scared and I need someone there who knows my face." And Decker Havens, 53 years old, former Marine engineer, twice divorced, 3 bad knees, and a reputation for being the kind of man who fixed things with his hands rather than his mouth, had said yes without hesitating. I found all of this out afterward. At the time, I just saw him as the quiet man who stood slightly behind his daughter at the reception, drinking something purple that he clearly didn't enjoy, watching every exit in the room with the calm, practiced eyes of someone who'd spent years making sure the people he cared about had a way out if they needed one. The summit's first 2 days were unremarkable. Politics at the galactic scale moves the way glaciers move. Everything looks still until suddenly it isn't, and by the time you notice the change, something enormous has already shifted. I was recording notes in the press alcove on day 2 when I first heard about the princess. Her name was Velarith Sarai. She was the queen's youngest daughter, 4th in line for the ascending throne, and she was 8 years old by Velkari reckoning, which corresponds roughly to about 12 in human developmental terms. She was small for her species. Her bioluminescence was still the soft, uncontrolled flicker of a child's, cycling through colors too fast, not yet settled into the measured harmonics of an adult Velkari. She had apparently asked her mother, with the particular relentlessness only children possess, to be allowed to observe part of the summit. The queen had refused 6 times. The princess had asked a 7th. The queen had relented, with conditions. The princess would observe from the upper gallery of the grand reception hall, accompanied by 2 royal guard units and her personal attendant, and she would stay there and not touch anything and not speak to anyone and not, under any circumstances, approach the lower floor where the delegations were actually operating. Every parent in the galaxy recognized those conditions and probably also recognized exactly how long they were going to last. I was in the grand reception hall on the afternoon of day 2, trying to catch a comment from the Rithkani head of delegation, when I heard the first sound. It wasn't a crash. That's what I tell people when they ask, and they always expect a crash. It was more like a breath. A collective intake of air from about 40 different respiratory systems simultaneously. The kind of sound a crowd makes when something happens that the crowd's brain hasn't fully processed yet, so the sound comes before the thought does. I turned. The gallery above the reception hall was a curved architectural feature about 30 feet above the main floor, a sweeping arc of bioluminescent stone that the Velkari used as an observation deck. The railing was Velkari scaled, meaning it was built for being 7 to 9 feet tall. The spacing between the rail posts was, and I remember doing this math in real time, standing there, about 22 inches. Velarith Sarai had been leaning on the railing to see better. She had slipped. She had slipped because she was 8 years old and curious, and the thing she wanted to see was the human delegation's interpreter device, which projected a light display when it translated, and she'd leaned too far forward to watch the lights. She was hanging, both hands on the bottom rail, feet scrabbling for purchase against the smooth stone face of the gallery, 30 feet of open air below her. The royal guards were at the gallery door. They'd moved to it instinctively, but the gallery deck was on the far side, and they couldn't get to her faster than gravity was going to make the decision. For a moment, and I want you to understand this moment because everything that follows lives inside it, for a moment, the entire grand reception hall of the Velkari throne world was simply frozen. 40 species, hundreds of beings, scientists, diplomats, warriors, politicians from across the sector. Nobody moved. I think, and I've spent a long time thinking about this, I think the problem was that everyone was calculating. Everyone was running the numbers, 30 feet, the drop rate, the child's grip strength, the distance to the nearest guard. Everyone was doing the math and arriving at the same answer, which was, there is not enough time. I did not see Decker Haven start moving. That's the honest truth. I was watching the princess, and then I was watching a human man in the air. He had crossed roughly 60 feet of reception hall floor in what I later measured, from the press footage, as approximately 4 seconds. He hadn't called out. He hadn't warned anyone. He had simply started running the moment the crowd had taken that breath, before the math was done, before the calculating began. He didn't have a plan. I want to be clear about that because people have tried to turn what happened next into something strategic, something calculated, and it wasn't. It was a man who saw a child about to fall, and his body made a decision that his brain was still catching up to. He grabbed a display table near the wall. One of those tall exhibition stands about 6 feet high, and he ran with it. Not dragging it, carrying it, one-handed. A table that 2 of the Rithcani delegates had struggled to position earlier that morning. He positioned it under the gallery. Then he looked up at the princess. And then he climbed onto the table and he reached up, and I remember thinking, even in that moment, even with everything happening, I remember thinking that 30 feet was still a very, very long way down, and he was standing on a table that was maybe 6 feet tall, and the math still didn't work. But he wasn't done. There was a secondary installation piece behind him, part of the diplomatic exchange display, one of those suspended geometric sculptures that the Velkhari use as aesthetic centerpieces. It was mounted on a bracket at about 14 feet. Decker grabbed the edge of it. It was not designed to bear weight. I need to be clear about that. It was decorative, and he pulled himself up. The bracket held, barely. I heard it complain in the particular voice that metal makes when it's being asked to do something it wasn't made for. 14 feet. He was at 14 feet. The princess was at 30. He looked up at her. She was looking down at him. Her bioluminescence had gone white, pure, flat white, which I later learned was the Velkhari expression of extreme fear. He said something to her. I couldn't hear what it was from where I was standing. But I saw her face. She was looking at this human man hanging off a decorative sculpture 16 feet below her, and she was 8 years old and terrified, and whatever he said, she heard it. She let go of the bottom railing with one hand. And she reached down. Now here's where I need you to understand something about Velkhari anatomy, because it matters enormously for what happened next. Adult Velkhari have upper limbs that are semi-articulated. They can extend significantly beyond what the resting position suggests, almost like telescoping. It's part of how they interact with their environment. They can reach. Children cannot do this as well. The full extension capability develops over time, alongside the other adult features. An 8-year-old Velkhari has maybe 60% of the adult extension capacity. But 60% of Velkhari arm extension is still about 40% more than a human arm. The princess reached down. Her fingers, 4 of them, longer than Decker's entire forearm, extended toward him. He grabbed them, and then the bracket gave way. I don't know if you've ever seen something fall in real time and your brain somehow processes it wrong, not in slow motion the way people describe, but fragmented, like a series of photographs where the gaps between them are just missing. That's how I remember the next 3 seconds. Decker fell. The princess fell. They were connected by his grip on her fingers and her grip on his wrist. The table below had shifted when he'd grabbed the sculpture. There was nothing underneath them but the reception hall floor. Then there was a sound. A sound I cannot describe with accuracy because I have never heard anything like it before or since. It was not a crash. It was not a thud. It was more like, imagine if the air itself flinched. A concussion of displacement. A pressure wave. The queen had moved. I do not know exactly when Her Eminence Saravith moved. The footage shows it happening in a time frame that is genuinely difficult to process. The Valkyrie are fast, much faster than their size suggests, but what I saw seemed to defy even that. She was at the edge of the reception floor, and then she was not. And then there was a column of amber and violet light where she was standing, and her 4 upper limbs were extended at full adult Valkyrie reach. She caught them, both of them, Decker in one set of limbs, the princess in another, 3 feet from the floor. The sound I heard was the queen's feet hitting the ground with the full transferred weight of 2 beings. Her own 11-foot frame, her daughter, and a 53-year-old human man, and the floor of the grand reception hall cracking slightly under the impact. The hall was absolutely silent. Then the princess started crying. And the queen held her daughter and held this human man she didn't know, and her bioluminescence, which had been pure violent red from the moment her daughter had slipped, cycled through something I had never seen before, through colors that didn't have names in the standard diplomatic color language reference, through something that the interpreter I spoke to later said, very quietly, was probably grief and terror and relief braided together so tightly they'd become a single thing. Decker was injured. Not fatally, but not lightly either. The fall, even the partial fall, had wrenched his shoulder badly. The bracket had torn a gash along his left arm when it gave way. He had a hairline fracture in 2 ribs from the way he'd been caught. Valkyrie grip strength, even cushioned, even controlled, is significant. He was conscious. That was the thing. He was conscious, and his first words, the first thing he said when he realized he was on the ground and alive and being held by the queen of the Valkyrie, were not about himself. He said, "Is she okay?" That's it, that's the first thing. He said it in English, which was the only language he had, and the diplomatic interpreters were still processing the last 3 minutes of sonic chaos. But he said it loudly enough, and with enough of a particular human intonation that apparently at least one Valkyrie in the room understood the shape of the question even without the words. The princess, still crying, bioluminescence flickering between white and pale gold, reached out one of her long fingers and touched his hand. He laughed. Of all the things, he laughed. That short, exhausted, shaking laugh that humans do when they've been terrified and the terror has just broken open like a wave, and what comes through the other side isn't happiness exactly, but something that sounds like it. And the queen of the Valkyrie, who had not spoken since she'd crossed the room, who had been holding these 2 beings with the careful stillness of someone who was afraid that moving would restart whatever disaster had almost finished, looked at this human man on the floor with tears still on his face from the adrenaline and blood on his arm, and his shoulder at an angle it wasn't supposed to be at. She looked at him for a long time. Her bioluminescence had settled into something I didn't have a reference for. Soft, slow, a color between amber and gold that pulsed in a rhythm that the interpreter later would tell me was the Valkyrie equivalent of a held breath, a color that meant I am not ready to let this moment end. The medical team arrived at minute 7. Valkyrie medics and 2 human physicians from Earth's delegation both simultaneously, which caused about 45 seconds of professional friction as they figured out jurisdiction. Decker, to his credit, lay on the floor and waited with the patience of a man who had learned that sometimes the best thing you can do is stay still and let other people sort it out. The queen had not moved away from him. This was noted by everyone in the room. This was the queen of the Valkyrie, an entity whose time and proximity were allocated by an entire administrative infrastructure designed around the protocol of who she stood near and for how long and what it meant. She did not stand near people. People were arranged to be near her. She was kneeling. She was kneeling on the cracked floor of her own grand reception hall, next to a human man she didn't know and watching the medics work with an intensity that made the senior medical officer visibly nervous. In that particular way, medical officers get nervous when the person looking over their shoulder has the ability to rearrange their career with a single word. The princess was beside her, still holding Decker's hand with one finger in the careful way you'd hold something you thought might break. He kept telling them he was fine. He said it in English, and then, apparently, the ship's interpreter drone had gotten close enough to relay it, and the princess heard the translation and said something back, and the drone translated it for Decker. She said, "You are not fine. I can see your arm is the wrong shape." He looked at his shoulder, then he said, "Fair point." And she laughed, a Velkari child's laugh, which sounds like wind through crystalline structures, like bells that haven't decided what note they want to be. And it echoed in that cracked and silent room, and I watched 4 different species worth of diplomats and scientists and politicians simultaneously do that thing people do when something unexpectedly beautiful happens in the middle of a catastrophe. They all exhaled. He was taken to the medical wing on level 4. The Queen accompanied him personally. Not as a diplomatic gesture, not as a formal action. She simply walked with the medical team. Her attendants followed, uncertain. Her protocol staff followed, more uncertain. The summit proceedings, which were supposed to resume in 40 minutes, quietly rescheduled themselves without anyone formally announcing it, because nobody wanted to be the one to say to the Queen of the Velkari that she had somewhere else to be. The princess walked beside her mother the whole way, still holding Decker's hand through the rail of the medical transport. I followed at press distance. I know I wasn't supposed to. Nobody stopped me. Level 4's medical wing was Velkari scaled, which meant every piece of furniture was sized for beings nearly twice Decker's height, and the medical bed they put him on looked faintly absurd. This medium-sized human man with his arm in a compression wrap, propped up on pillows that were bigger than he was, in a room glowing with soft amber Velkari bioluminescent lighting. The Queen sat beside him. She folded herself down with the particular grace of the Velkari, that quality they have of making large movements look like small ones, of occupying space without imposing on it, and she sat, and she looked at him, and through the interpreter drone she said, "Why did you do that?" He looked at her for a moment, then he said she was going to fall. The Queen said she was not your child. He said she was somebody's child. I need to stop here and be honest with you about something. I have covered first contact events. I have been in rooms when species met for the first time, and everything was new and charged and dangerous. I have seen moments that historians decided were significant later, and I've seen moments that everyone knew were significant in real time. What happened in that medical room was the second kind. The Queen of the Velkari, this ancient, extraordinary, luminous being whose people had been navigating interstellar space when humanity was still figuring out agriculture, sat beside this one human man and heard him say she was somebody's child, and something shifted in her face. Not dramatically. Not in the movie way, not with music and widened eyes. In the quiet way. The way a tide changes direction. You can't point to the exact moment it happened, but you know afterward that everything is moving differently than it was. Her bioluminescence, which had been cycling through that slow amber gold, deepened. It went still, which the interpreter would tell me much later was extraordinarily rare for a Velkari. Their bioluminescence was involuntary. It responded to emotional state the way human faces responded to emotion. A truly still bioluminescence meant a state so profound it overwhelmed the usual cycling. She said very quietly, "What is your name?" He said, "Decker." She said, "Decker," like she was placing it somewhere. "I have a question for you." He said, "All right." She said, "When you began to run, did you know you would reach her?" He thought about it. I watched him actually think about it, not performing consideration but genuinely sitting with the question. Then he said, "No, I didn't know, but the alternative was standing still and I couldn't do that." The Queen looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "We have a word for that. In our oldest language, the language before the diplomatic forms, the word is Velserath." He asked what it meant. She said, "It means the movement toward. The act of going toward a thing that frightens you because the cost of not going is higher than the cost of the fear. It is the root of every act of courage we have recorded in 7,000 years of history." She paused. We did not know humans had it. Decker made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a scoff, something between the two. He said, "We've had it. We've had it since the beginning. We're just usually terrible at knowing when to use it." And the Queen did something I had never seen a Velkhari do to a non-Velkhari. She placed her hand over his. Not carefully, not formally, with the particular weight of something decided. She said, "Then I am glad you knew today." The summit resumed the following morning. Decker spent the night in the medical wing with a repaired shoulder, wrapped ribs, and a sealed arm wound that the Velkhari medical technology had closed in about 11 minutes. A process that had taken his breath away and made him very quietly say something that the interpreter translated as "That's genuinely incredible" before he'd apparently remembered. He was in a professional diplomatic setting. The princess had visited 3 times before morning. Each time she brought something, first a piece of Velkhari ceremonial food that he'd eaten with polite uncertainty, second a small carved stone in the shape of something that might have been a local animal or might have been abstract art, third nothing at all, just herself, sitting beside his bed in the way children sit when they don't have an agenda and don't need one. He'd taught her a card game, not with real cards, with pieces of the wrapped supply packets from his med kit, which he'd drawn suit symbols on with a marker he'd found in his jacket pocket. She'd beaten him twice. He'd accused her of cheating, very gently. She'd laughed that wind chime laugh and not denied it. I got my interview with the Queen on day 3. Not because I'd asked, and not because of my credentials. Because Decker Havens had mentioned me, apparently casually, apparently in the way he mentioned things, which was without fanfare, and the Queen had asked who I was, and he'd said I was a journalist who'd been trying to get this interview for 3 years, and she'd said bring him tomorrow morning. I want you to understand the significance of that. I want you to understand that the Queen of the Velkhari granted me an interview, because a human man she'd known for less than 24 hours had said I was worth talking to. I sat across from Her Eminence Saravith of the 7th Ascending Throne, and I asked her what I'd been planning to ask for 3 years. About the summit, about interspecies diplomacy, about the future of Sector 9. She answered those questions. She answered them well. She was precisely what I'd expected, brilliant, measured, profound in that particular way of beings who have seen so much history they no longer mistake the temporary for the permanent. And then at the end, I asked about Decker. I asked what she was going to do now. She said, "He will heal here. We have better medical facilities than what his home station offers, and his injuries are significant enough to require monitoring." I said, "And after he heals?" She looked at me for a long moment. Her bioluminescence moved in that slow amber gold I was beginning to recognize. She said, "I have not decided yet whether I will let him go." I said carefully, "He'll want to return home eventually. He has a life there." She said, "Yes, I know." Another pause. "That is what makes it complicated." I didn't fully understand what she meant until day 5, when Decker asked to speak with me. He was sitting up in the medical bed, better, visibly better, the Velkhari medical technology doing things that made Earth's best hospitals look like very earnest amateurs. And he had the look of a man who had been lying in a quiet room thinking for 4 days and had arrived somewhere unexpected. He said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. He said, "Do you think she's serious, the Queen? When she says things like that she's glad I'm here, that she's not ready for me to leave. Do you think that's diplomatic language or something else? I told him I wasn't sure. I told him what I'd noticed, the stillness of her bioluminescence, the way she'd sat beside him, the words she'd used. He was quiet for a while, then he said, I have a life back on Kepler station. I've got a workshop. I've got a cat. I have Kala's mom's anniversary coming up and I visit her grave every year and He stopped, looked at the ceiling. I came here to make sure my daughter was okay, he said. That was the whole plan. Come, stay 2 weeks, make sure she's got her feet under her, go home. I said, is she okay? He said, she's brilliant. She's the most capable person I've ever met. She doesn't need me here. I said, but... He looked at me. He said, but the Queen's daughter holds my hand like I'm something that matters. And the Queen, she talks to me like, I don't know how to explain it. She talks to me like I'm real in a way that not a lot of people bother to make you feel real anymore. He paused. She's a queen, he said, of an entire world. She doesn't need anything. She has everything. And somehow she sits beside me in a medical room and asks me why I ran and actually listens to the answer. He shook his head. I'm 53 years old, he said. I've got bad knees and I fix engines for a living and I'm not anybody. I'm Kala's dad. That's the best thing about me and I'm fine with that. I made peace with that a long time ago. But he stopped again, looked at his hands, said very quietly. She looked at me like I was the most interesting thing she'd seen in a long time. I left Decker that evening with more to think about than I'd arrived with. That happens sometimes in this job. You go to get information, and instead you get something you didn't have a category for yet. Some feeling or observation that sits in your chest for days before your brain figures out where to put it. I went back to the press alcove, and I sat down, and I looked at my notes, and I thought about a 53-year-old man who fixed engines, and visited his ex-wife's grave once a year, and had crossed 60 feet of alien diplomatic hall in 4 seconds because a child was falling, and the alternative was standing still. And then I thought about a queen who had been alive for something approaching 600 years, who had attended 93 interstellar summits, who had 7 children and had outlived 2 of them, who governed a species that had been mapping stars before human beings had names for them. And I thought, oh, this is complicated. Day 6. Decker was cleared for limited mobility. He walked, with the particular careful walk of a man whose ribs are reminding him of every decision he's ever made, to the garden deck on level 3, which was one of the summit's shared recreational spaces. The princess found him there within 11 minutes. I don't know how she knew where he was. Possibly her attendant told her. Possibly the Velkari had some form of environmental awareness I wasn't privy to. Possibly she just looked in the obvious places. She came and sat beside him on a bench that was designed for Velkari adults, which meant she fit it reasonably, and he was sitting on a piece of furniture where his feet didn't touch the ground, and he looked faintly ridiculous and seemed completely unbothered by this. She said something to him through the interpretation drone. He said, "What?" She repeated it. The drone translated, "Do you have children?" He said, "One, a daughter. She's here actually. She's one of the scientists at the summit." The princess processed this. Then she said, "Is she older than me?" He laughed. He said, "She's 26, so yes." The princess considered this seriously. Then she said, "Do you love her very much?" He said, and his voice had something in it that I recognized, because it's a sound parents make when a question about their kids hits them straight in the place they keep the truest things, more than anything, more than I know what to do with, honestly. The princess nodded slowly. Then she said, "I think that is why you ran." He looked at her. She said, "You understood what it would mean. If you did not run, you understood because you know what it is to be the one who would be waiting at the bottom." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Yeah, I think you're right." She reached over and patted his hand with one finger. This very particular gesture she developed, this precise and gentle contact that she seemed to have calibrated specifically for his size. And then she looked out at the garden and didn't say anything else for a while. Neither did he. I watched them sitting there, this enormous alien child and this ordinary human man, in a garden on a world that wasn't either of theirs, in a comfortable silence that seemed to have been going on for years. The Queen came to the garden at hour 3. Her presence changed the room the way weather changes a room, not abruptly, not noisily, but in that slow tidal way where you become aware that the atmospheric pressure has shifted and everything around you has quietly reoriented towards something. She stood at the edge of the garden path and looked at her daughter and Decker sitting on the bench, and her bioluminescence did that thing, the still amber gold thing, the color that didn't cycle, and then she walked toward them. The princess looked up. The Queen said something to her daughter. The princess said something back. The Queen said something else. The princess stood, with the particular dignity of a child who is being sent away and knows it, and is also secretly a little relieved because she'd been sitting for a long time and was bored. She patted Decker's hand again before she left. He watched her go and smiled. The Queen sat beside him, not with ceremony, not with the formal arrangement of limbs that Velkari used in official settings. She sat the way she'd sat in the medical room, the way she apparently sat when she wasn't performing the role of Queen and was simply being the being inside the role. She said she likes you. He said, I like her, she's remarkable. She said she is. A pause. She has been quieter since her sister died 2 years ago, the third daughter. She and Sarai were close. Another pause. She has been careful with herself since then. The way children get careful after loss, as though caring too much for a thing might mean losing it. He was very still. He said, I know that feeling. She said, your wife. He looked at her. He said, the interpreter told you. She said, I asked. I hope that is not an imposition. He considered it, said no. It's fine. Yeah, she died 8 years ago. Cancer. We'd been divorced for 4 years before that, but that doesn't mean what people think it means. The Queen said, what does it mean? He said, it means you stopped living together. Doesn't mean you stopped caring about whether someone's okay. Doesn't mean that just stops. She said, no, I suppose it doesn't. They sat with that for a moment. Then she said, Kala, your daughter, she has her mother's name. He said, her middle name. We had always planned to use it if we had a daughter. We kept that plan even after. The Queen's bioluminescence did something new, something I could see from where I was, carefully and quietly not being noticed at the garden's far edge. It moved in a slow spiral, like water finding the center of a basin. I didn't know what that meant. I looked it up later. The interpreter told me it was the Velkari equivalent of a chest ache, an involuntary physical response to recognizing grief in something outside yourself. Sympathy, the bioluminescent expression of sympathy. She said, you are a remarkable man, Decker. He made that sound again, the not quite laugh, the deflecting sound. He said, I'm really not. I'm about as unremarkable as people get. She said, you keep saying that. I find it unconvincing. He said, with respect, Your Eminence, you might just be in an unusual position to evaluate. She said, how do you mean? He said, you've been on the throne since before my species figured out how to leave our own solar system. You've seen everything, historically speaking, in terms of what a being can be and do and experience. Compared to that, I'm a Tuesday afternoon. I'm genuinely a Tuesday. She looked at him. Her bioluminescence moved slowly, and I didn't need an interpreter to understand that expression because I knew it from every face I'd ever seen when someone is trying not to smile. She said, I have lived 612 years. I have attended 93 interstellar summits. I have met every significant political figure in this sector for the last 4 centuries. I have been courted by kings and challenged by warlords and reasoned with by entities whose intelligence makes most beings look like early drafts. A pause. I have never, in 612 years, met anyone who told me they were a Tuesday afternoon. He said, well, now you have. She said very quietly, yes, now I have. Day 7 was the last official day of the summit. The agreements were signed. The food was consumed with various degrees of sincerity. The photographs were taken. The press corps filed their initial stories, most of which focused on the diplomatic outcomes and mentioned the incident with the princess in 2 paragraphs in the lower section. I was writing something different. The human delegation prepared to depart. Their shuttle was scheduled for the following morning. Decker had spent the previous 2 days, post-medical clearance, post-garden conversations, post-long evenings in the Velkari common rooms where the princess had taught him 3 games, and he'd beaten her at 2, and she'd accused him of cheating, gently, and he hadn't denied it. He'd spent those days saying something that looked very much like goodbye. To the princess, to the medics who'd treated him and who'd become unexpectedly familiar over the course of a week, to the junior palace staff who'd taken to stopping by his corridor because he'd apparently acquired the human reputation of the person who had good snacks and would share them with anyone who asked. He hadn't said goodbye to the Queen. I think neither of them had quite gotten there yet. The morning of departure, I was in the docking bay at hour 5, an hour before the delegation was due, because I had a habit of arriving early to things that felt like they might be important. I was the only press there. I think the others had decided the story was done. Decker arrived at hour 5:15, alone, ahead of the rest of the delegation. He had his bag. He had that careful walk of healing ribs. He had the look of a man who had made a decision and was honoring it with the particular dignified resignation of someone who is choosing the right thing over the good thing. He stood at the docking window and looked out at the stars. I didn't approach him. It seemed wrong somehow, like interrupting something. He stood there for about 20 minutes. Then the doors opened behind him. The Queen walked in alone. Not with her attendants, not with the protocol staff, not with the guard units or the administrative infrastructure that usually surrounded her like a well-organized solar system. Alone. She was not wearing her formal bioluminescent-enhancing garb. She was in something simpler. I don't know enough about Velkari fashion to describe it with authority, but it registered as less deliberate, more personal. She walked to where Decker was standing, and she stopped beside him, and they both looked out the window at the stars for a moment. Then she said, "You are leaving." He said, "Yeah, my daughter's shuttle is in about an hour." She said, "Your daughter does not need an escort home. She is, by all accounts, one of the most competent beings at this summit." He said, she really is." A pause. He said, "But I promised I'd see her home. That was the deal." The Queen said, "Is that the only reason?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the stars. Then he said, "Your Eminence." She said, "Saravath, please." That stopped him. He looked at her, this enormous luminous being who had governed a world for 6 centuries, who had just asked him to use her given name, and I watched his expression do something complicated. Something that went through several things very quickly and arrived somewhere quiet. He said, "Saravath," like he was testing the weight of it, "I need to go home. I have a life. A small life, but it's mine. I have work and I have a cat and I have a grave I visit. I'm not the kind of person who belongs in a place like this." She said, "Why not?" He said, "Because I don't know how. I'm not diplomatic. I don't know your customs. I fixed engines for 30 years and I know how to do that, and I know how to be Kala's dad, and those are the things I'm good at. This is your world. I'd break something just by walking wrong." She said, "You already broke the floor." He looked at her. She said, when I caught you. The impact cracked the floor of the grand reception hall. A pause. I have not had it repaired. He said, why not? She said, because I find I do not mind the evidence that something happened. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I'm 53 years old. She said, I am 612. He said, my species lives to about 90 if we're lucky. She said, I know. He said, that's a hard math, Saravith. She said, yes. He said, I don't understand why he stopped, started again. You have everything, you have a whole world, you have 6 children, you have 6 centuries of everything. What is it about? She said, you ran. He was quiet. She said, in 612 years, in every summit and court and diplomatic event I have attended, in all the rooms full of powerful beings calculating the cost of every action, I have never watched anyone simply run toward a thing without first deciding whether it was worth it, without the calculation, without the politics. Her bioluminescence moved in that deep, slow amber. You saw my daughter and you ran. You didn't know if you'd reach her. You ran anyway. She said, do you know how rare that is? He said, it's not rare. Any parent would have. She said, she was not your child. He said, quieter this time, because she'd used his own words back at him and he recognized them. She was somebody's child. She said, yes. A long pause. She said, and when I heard you say that, when I understood what you meant, I thought, here is a being who understands what is worth running toward. And I thought, I would like to know more of that. I would like to be near more of that. He said, Saravith. She said, I am not asking you to stay. I am asking you to, she paused, searching for the word. I am asking whether the door is open. That is all. Whether, if I sent word, if there were occasions where your presence might be. He said, yeah. She looked at him. He said, yeah, the door's open. He turned to look at her properly, this small human man looking up at this luminous, impossible ancient queen, and his expression was the most straightforward thing I'd seen all week. I don't know what this is. I don't have words for it, but the door's open. If you, yeah, the door's open. Her bioluminescence went still. That deep, complete stillness. And then, very slowly, it began to move again, but not in the cycling she'd had before. In something new, something I hadn't seen from her in 7 days of watching very carefully. The interpreter would tell me later when I described it, that the pattern I was describing, slow, warm, expanding outward from the center, was a pattern that had a word in Velkari. The word was something like Velera, which translated very roughly as the feeling of a thing beginning. The princess found them at hour 6. She had apparently understood that the shuttle was leaving and had communicated this to her attendants with the focused determination of someone who had decided that an important thing was going to happen and she was going to be present for it. She came into the docking bay at a speed that was not quite running, but was as close as royal protocol permitted, and she stopped in front of Decker and looked at him. He looked at her. She said, and the interpretation drone caught it very clearly in the quiet room, you will come back. It was not a question. He said, yeah, I'll come back. She said, you promise. He said, I promise. She considered this seriously, the way children consider things seriously with their whole face. Then she said, I will practice the card game while you are gone. When you return, I will beat you every time. He said, I think you've been cheating. I still haven't figured out how, but I know you have. She laughed. That wind chime sound, filling the docking bay, bouncing off the walls and the ships and the lights. She laughed and then she held out her hand, all 4 long fingers extended, which the interpreter told me later was the Velkari gesture for something that had no direct translation, but meant something in the neighborhood of I trust you with the soft part. He put his hand in hers. She folded her fingers gently around it. They stood like that for a moment. Then she let go, with the particular grace of someone who has decided to be brave about something, and she stepped back, and she stood beside her mother. Calla came into the docking bay at 10 minutes to departure and stopped when she saw the scene her father, standing in the docking bay of an alien throne world, looking like he'd aged about 15 years, and somehow also looked more alive than she'd seen him in a decade. She looked at him, she looked at the Queen, she looked at the princess. She said, "Dad." He said, "Hey, kid." She said, "What did you do?" He said, "I mostly got caught." She said, "What?" He said, "The Queen caught me when I fell. She caught both of us." Calla looked at the Queen. Her expression went through something that I, as a parent watcher of 22 years, recognized as the particular emotion a child feels when they realize their parent has a whole life that exists outside of being their parent, and that this life is possibly more interesting and more complicated and more real than they had fully appreciated. She said to the Queen, "Thank you for catching him." The Queen looked at Calla. Her bioluminescence moved in something gentle. She said, "He was worth catching." Calla looked at her father. He was looking at the ceiling, the way people look at the ceiling when they're embarrassed, but also secretly very touched. She said, "Dad, are you?" He said, "I'm fine, I'm good. Let's get on the shuttle." She said, "Okay." She started toward the boarding corridor, then stopped, turned back, said to the Queen, "He's a good man. He's the best person I know. I just want you to know that." The Queen said, "I know." Calla nodded, walked to the corridor, stopped once more and said, "Not to anyone in particular, just sort of to the room. He visits my mother's grave every year. First Sunday in October. He brings her favorite flowers. He's done it for 8 years. She paused. "He thinks I don't know, I know." Then she walked onto the shuttle. Decker picked up his bag. He stood in front of the Queen. He said, "I'm not very good at goodbyes. I never have been." She said, "Then do not call it one." He said, "No." She said, "Call it, what did you say? The door is open. Call it leaving the door open." He looked at her. Then he held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment, this very human gesture, this small and ancient human way of marking an agreement, a connection, a moment that matters, and then she placed one of her hands around his. Not the way you'd shake hands, the way you'd hold something, the way the princess had held his hand all week, with that particular careful weight that means I know what you are and I am not going to be careless with it. She said, "Come back, Decker." He said, "Yeah." He said, "I will." I watched the shuttle leave from the observation deck. I watched it get smaller against the stars. I watched it become a point of light, and then I watched the point of light disappear into the distances between things. The Queen stood beside me on the observation deck. I hadn't realized she'd come up until I became aware of that atmospheric shift, that tidal reorientation. I said without planning to, without professional consideration, just honestly, "Are you all right?" She said, "Yes." A pause. "I am always all right. It is a requirement of the position." I said, "That sounds exhausting." She said, "It is." Another pause. He said that once, not in those words, but in that way humans have of saying the true thing when they don't realize they're saying it. I thought about all the things I was supposed to ask, all the diplomatic angles and political implications and historical significances I had spent 3 years preparing questions for. I said, "Do you think you'll see him again?" She said, "Yes." I said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because he made a promise to my daughter and he is a man who keeps promises." She watched the empty space where the shuttle had been. "And because." She stopped. Her bioluminescence moved in that Velara pattern, that slow expanding warmth. She said, "Because I refused to let him go even now, even when he left. There is a part of me that went with that shuttle, and that means some part of him is still here, and eventually the two parts will want to be in the same place." She looked out at the stars. That is what I have learned, she said, in 612 years. The things that matter, they have a gravity, they pull. He came back in October. Not the October of the same year. 4 months wasn't enough time to arrange the diplomacy of a return visit to a throne world, but the October of the following year. I know because I was on Velaris for a different assignment, and I got a message from my editor saying that a human named Decker Havens had been granted a personal invitation to the Velkari throne world outside of any official summit, which was something that had never happened before in the history of Velkari human relations. And did I want the story? I said yes. I got to the palace on the afternoon he arrived, and I was standing in the entrance hall when he came through the doors. He looked better than when I'd last seen him. Rested, that's the word. Like something he'd been carrying had been redistributed into something more manageable. He had flowers with him. Velkari equivalents. He'd apparently asked someone back on Kepler Station to research what Velkari flora was considered significant, what would be appropriate, what would be the right thing. He was holding a careful arrangement of things that glowed faintly in their own right, because on a world of bioluminescent beings, even the flowers have something to say for themselves. The princess came running. She did not observe any protocol. She came running the moment she saw him, and she stopped about 3 feet away, and then, with tremendous dignity, walked the last 3 feet. He laughed, she laughed. She said, I have been practicing. He said, I know, I'm worried. She said, you should be. She was taller, almost imperceptibly, the way children are taller when you see them again after time, not dramatically, just the quiet ongoing evidence of ongoing life. He noticed, I saw him notice. He said, you got taller. She said, you got grayer. He said, that's your fault. She said, that is fair. The queen found him in the garden, the same bench. He was already there when she came. He'd gone there first, before his rooms, before anything. Just gone straight to the garden and sat down, like coming back to a place that had been holding something for him while he was away. She sat beside him. Neither of them said anything for a while. Then he said, I brought flowers. Not for you specifically, for he paused. The princess mentioned that there was a memorial garden for your daughter, for Velarith Kaya. I thought if that was appropriate. She looked at him. It is appropriate, she said. He said, I didn't want to overstep. She said, you came back. Everything else is within the permission that implies. He was quiet. Then he said, first Sunday in October. She said, yes. He said, I brought the flowers here, but I went to her grave before I left. Kala's mother's, I told her about you. He paused. I don't know if that's strange, it might be strange. It felt right. The queen said, what did you tell her? He said, I told her I met someone remarkable, that I wasn't replacing anything. That remarkable things have their own space, they don't push other things out. I told her I thought she would have liked to know about it. The queen's bioluminescence moved. That pattern, Velora. She said, I would have liked to have known her. He said, I think you would have gotten along. She said, why? He said, she was also not particularly impressed by me until something happened that she didn't expect. He paused. Apparently I'm a slow revelation. She said very quietly, yes, you are. She said, you are worth the wait. He stayed for 3 weeks that October. He learned 11 words of Old Velkari. He played cards with the princess every evening and lost approximately 60% of the time, which he maintained was impossible without cheating, and which she maintained was simply the natural result of her superior intellect. He ate strange food and described it to Kala in a video message that she sent me a clip of later, with his permission, and it was the most human 5 minutes I had watched since leaving Earth. Just a man sitting in an alien kitchen talking to his daughter about something weird he'd eaten. gesturing with his hands the way people do when words aren't quite enough. He fixed something in the palace engineering wing, because nobody could stop him from noticing that one of the gravity generators in level 6 was producing a micro-vibration that would eventually cause problems. He went and fixed it without being asked, and without telling anyone until it was done, and the engineering staff apparently spent about 3 days figuring out what had changed. He was, by all accounts, exactly himself, which was, apparently, exactly what was wanted. On the last night, I found him on the observation deck. He was looking at the stars again. He did that, I'd noticed it both times, the way he went to the windows when he was thinking, as though the distance helped. I said, "Another departure." He said, "Yeah." I said, "How do you feel about it this time?" He was quiet. Then he said, "Different. The first time it felt like leaving. This time it feels like, I don't know, like a comma, like a pause in the middle of a sentence." I said, "That's a good way to put it." He said, "She taught me that word. Velara. I've been thinking about it a lot." He looked at the stars, the feeling of a thing beginning. She said it, I didn't know what it meant at the time, and then I looked it up after I got home and I sat with it for a while. I said, "And?" He said, "And I think I've been wrong about myself for a long time. I told myself the best thing about me was being Kala's dad, which is true. That is the best thing about me. But I think I also told myself that was the only thing, that the rest of it, the rest of whatever I was, had kind of used up." He paused, and then I fell 30 feet and got caught by a queen, and I think maybe I was wrong about the used up part. I said, "She didn't let you go." He smiled, small, tired in a good way. He said, "No, she didn't." He said, "Stubborn, for someone so elegant." I said, "Don't tell her I said this, but I think that's exactly what she'd consider a compliment." He laughed, properly this time, not the deflecting sound but the real one. He said, "I'll be back in the spring. We didn't say it officially yet, but yeah, spring." I said, "Will you stay longer?" He considered it. He said, "Kala thinks I should move the workshop, not permanently. Kepler Station has a satellite facility on a planet in the next system over from Velkari territory. 3-hour transit. I could do the work from there, keep going, keep being what I am." He looked at the stars. "What I am," he said, "turns out to be someone she wants around. And I'm still figuring out what to do with that. I'm still processing it. But I think the answer is yes." I published my interview with the Queen a month after leaving Velaris. Not the interview I'd been planning for 3 years, a different one. It ran 30,000 words, which was more than I'd published in a single piece in my career. My editor asked me to cut it. I asked her to read it first. She read it and didn't ask again. It was not an interview about politics or diplomacy or the future of Sector 9. It was an interview about a crack in the floor of the grand reception hall that hadn't been repaired. About a child who laughed like wind through crystals and had beaten a human man at cards because she'd read the manual while he was recovering from his injuries. About a queen who had lived 600 years and had never, until a Tuesday afternoon in the diplomatic hall of her own throne world, watched a being run towards something without calculating the cost first. And about what that meant, about what it did to you to see that. To watch a creature, fragile as most things that matter are fragile, limited as most things that love are limited, just go, without the calculation, without the strategy, just because a child was falling and the alternative was standing still. The interview ended with something she'd said to me on that last morning. Something I'd almost cut because it seemed too large for the space I'd put it in. I asked her what she wanted people to know, about the whole thing, about humans, about Decker. She said, "There's a quality your species has that we have not been able to map. We have cataloged human literature and human history and human conflict and human art, and we have built models and theories and taxonomies, and we are still not able to fully account for it. The thing you do when you are frightened, and you do it anyway. The thing that looks like irrationality from the outside, but is something else entirely from the inside. We have a word for it, Velserath, the movement toward, but having the word does not mean we have the thing. Decker gave my daughter back to me. Not with a plan, not with strategy or calculation or anything I could have predicted or prepared for. He gave her back because he was the kind of thing that runs toward falling children, and that kind of thing is not made in a moment. It is made in years and decades of small choices that build towards something that holds. That is what I refused to let go of. Not a man, a thing I recognized, a thing I had not seen in all my centuries in all my rooms and did not want to lose. I think your species is more remarkable than you have been given credit for. I think you are more remarkable than you give yourself credit for. I think the universe does not yet know what it has in you. Decker moved his workshop in February. The satellite facility on Calva Station, 3 hours from Velkari territory. He sent me a message the day he arrived, 3 words. Doors still open. I kept the message, I still have it. I keep it for the same reason. The Queen didn't repair the crack in her floor. Because some evidence of something happening is worth more than a clean surface.